Hi, my name is Mike Dillard, and this is Self-Made Man, the podcast for men who want to leave their mark on the world and create a legacy of honor, integrity, and achievement in every aspect of their lives. I'm glad you're here, and once again, it is time to forge your destiny. One of the most powerful points of leverage that you can create in your life is to master the art of communicating with your fellow human beings. Really, this knowledge can make the difference in so many areas of our lives, from getting a first date to making a sale to getting your business funded or hiring a leader who will go on to 10x your company. Well, today we have a chance to learn how to captivate people from the woman who literally wrote the book on the subject, Vanessa Van Edwards. Vanessa spent her life decoding the way that people communicate, and today she's going to share some incredibly valuable lessons that can transform your business and personal life when it comes to people. Now, one of the most interesting parts of our discussion today is the fact that she and her team spent years decoding every major TED Talk in order to determine why some ended up going viral with tens of millions of views and while others didn't. Well, they figured it out. They cracked the code. And today you're going to learn the secrets behind the biggest TED Talks in history and how you can apply those techniques into your next presentation. You're also going to learn how to attract and win over your enemies, how to connect with the biggest names and leaders in your industry, and how to create a positive impression and impact within minutes of meeting someone or walking into a room filled with strangers. One successful new relationship can literally change the course of your life, so this is absolutely a subject that all of us need to pay attention to and to master. So with that being said, please help me welcome Vanessa Van Edwards. Welcome back, everybody. Mike Dillard here, and I don't know about you, but being a podcaster for the last year and a half has really presented some unique challenges when it comes to meeting amazing, interesting, smart individuals that I can interview on the show every single week. We're up to over 100 episodes, and typically the people that you want to interview are not the easiest folks to get a hold of. They're very successful and they're very busy, and yet they can open up huge doors. Having them on the show can build amazing relationships. And there really is an art and a science to this process. So we have an opportunity today to speak to an expert on how to essentially network and meet individuals who have really the ability to change your life and your business for sure. And we're going to dive into this topic because I know it's something that a lot of folks struggle with, because I'm really approached by them every single day, usually in a not so productive or successful manner. So we're going to change that today. And we're going to be talking to Vanessa Van Edwards, who's the author of Captivate, The Science of Succeeding with People. So, Vanessa, I'm extremely excited to have you on the show to cover a topic that we really have yet to cover here on Self-Made Man. So I'm extremely excited about the episode today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So you've been a successful entrepreneur for many years. You've made it your business to essentially study the science of humans and behavior, if you will. Every single day, I get emails, usually from PR people or just individuals who are like, hey, I would love to be on your podcast to promote my stuff or whatever it may be. But the approach is just horrific, and the answer is an automatic no every single time.
Right.
So I would love to know how we can be more effective when it comes to networking, when it comes to establishing relationships with important people. And I think the best place to start really is how in the world you got interested in this topic and involved, and really how did you become one of the world's biggest authorities on it?
So I started off as a journalist, science journalism. I'd always been interested in science. I'd always been interested in human behavior. And one of the things I found as a writer was that there was all these amazing academic studies that were being put out by organizations, academic institutions, and no one was reading them, right? Like there were these amazing studies, years of dissertation work, and no one was reading them, or they weren't being shared. So I started to go through every study looking for usable nuggets. And then I would turn that little nugget into an article for a publication. And very early on, I realized this was okay, but it wasn't really paying the bills. And I didn't find my content to be very sticky. And so I thought to myself, what could I do to differentiate my writing and my business? At that point, I wasn't really trying to sell any products or anything like that. It was purely just being paid for article. And I realized that I had to create something that no one else could steal. Because one thing I was running into, and I'm sure entrepreneurs listening run into this all the time, is that people were stealing my content. Like I would go write an article and then someone would take my article and then write a new introduction and then just copy and paste what I had written. And so I was like, the one thing I could do that would be different is if I somehow did my own research. And so very slowly I started to try to apply the study that I was looking at to my own life. And people loved it. The media PR was like, yes, we love when people do their own research, and made it harder for people to copy me. And slowly that grew into a lab, which now I run a human behavior research lab where we do massive, massive experiments. And that was really the turning point to just being a casual observer of human behavior to actually studying it, packaging it, and selling it.
Well, I would love to learn more about humans in general. So I think this is an amazing opportunity that a lot of us take for granted and that you've literally turned into a science. And so let's just walk through some of the biggest discoveries that you've made that have proven to be the most useful for yourself and those you work with.
Yeah. So, the very first thing, you actually mentioned it a little bit earlier, is that when we are trying to impress impressive people or pitching VIPs, there's kind of two different ways it happens, especially for entrepreneurs. So the first way is one-to-one. So coffee meetings, cold pitching emails, maybe if you're lucky, a warm lead introduction via email or a phone call. And the second way is public speaking, pitching a panel of investors, giving a presentation, speaking or presenting in front of a boardroom. And those are actually, they seem very different, but when we're talking about human behavior, the laws are the same. And I accidentally stumbled upon this. I used to think that they were very different, like the strategies for a coffee meeting were different than a big pitch. But I accidentally stumbled upon the fact that this was not the case. And whenever I'm deciding on a research experiment, I'm always looking for puzzles. I love puzzles. I love things that don't seem to make sense on the outside. So I'm a TED Talk junkie. I love watching TED Talks. I typically watch one every day at lunch. And I was sitting one day watching TED.com and looking for a new talk. And I typed in the leadership, in the search bar, leadership, because that's a topic I love. And up popped two talks. And I'm sure listeners are familiar with one of them, which is Simon Sinek's talk. And at the time, I think it had, something ridiculous, like 45 million views. And the other talk that came up right next to it was a talk by Fields Wicker Murin, which had under 20,000. I looked at these two talks and I thought there was something interesting here. They were both 18 minutes long. They were both almost the same title, like, How Leaders Can Succeed or Leadership of the Future. Very, very similar titles. They were both put out the same month of the same year, September 2009. And they were both given by relatively unknown experts at the time. Now, that TED Talk made Simon Sinek famous, but at the time it didn't. And I wondered, why some talks go viral? Some people, they walk into a room and you go, I want to meet that person. Or someone starts speaking and you go, yeah, I'm going to like this person. And others, you get bored within the first few seconds, you click off the video, you forget their name, you don't ask for their business card. They sort of blend into the background. What is the difference? So what we decided to do was embark on a massive TED Talk study where we coded thousands of hours of TED Talks, looking for the difference between the most popular videos and the least popular videos based on view count. And we found that there were distinct patterns between the most and least popular TED Talkers. And typically, these happen in the first few seconds. They indicated somehow to their audience that they were worth listening to. And what's crazy about it is that these patterns, and I'm happy to go through them if you'd like, are the same whether...
I would love for you to. I'm super interested in this, so yeah. Yeah,
they were the same whether someone takes a stage or walks into a boardroom or walks into a coffee shop. And that really, really surprised me. So that was, I think, one of they're actually the human behavior laws that guide us and guide our influence are very similar across domains. So when you look at a TED Talk, very fast, only 18 minutes. And the nice thing about this experiment was that on a video, it's very clear to see view count, right? Like there's a clear voting mechanism of, did this capture people's imagination or did they click off? So the very first, very obvious pattern that we found was that the most popular TED Talkers used more hand gestures. We literally counted every single hand gesture in all these talks. The most popular TED Talkers, one with the most view counts, have an average of 465 hand gestures in 18 minutes, where the least popular TED Talkers have an average of 271 hand gestures in 18 minutes. Huge, huge difference.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea why?
I mean, my best guess is the more hand movements, the more energetic the presentation seems. And I don't know, though.
Yeah. So it's partially energy. And when we asked participants to rate some of these videos, we were asking them to rate them on a couple different qualities. Overall, right? That's an easy one. Charisma, intelligence, and credibility. So you're absolutely right that hand gestures had a factor in charisma, the excitement or engagement. The other interesting one that I think when I dove into the hand gesture research, because I was so surprised at how stark the difference was. I mean, normally when we're doing research experiments, we're lucky if we find a 5 or 6% difference. The fact that it was almost double was just astounding to me. And so I dove into the hand gesture research and found that there was actually quite a robust amount of academic research to support this idea. We as humans like to see someone's hands, don't just like to see someone's hands, we need to see someone's hands as an element of trust. For example, if you can't see someone's hands when they're speaking, the fear part of your brain in the amygdala begins to activate. It's as if not seeing someone's hands, you wonder, what's their intention? What's their explanation? Are they going to reach out and shake my hand? Are they going to explain themselves? Are they going to be carrying a weapon? I think that it's a survival mechanism left over from our caveman days, that when we were approached by a stranger caveman, we were kind of going, are they carrying a rock or a spear? Are they going to hurt us? And so what's interesting about this is there's beginner and advanced to this. As I began to dive into how it was practical, it's one thing to just say, use more hand gestures, but that's not enough. I think we have to break it down. The first thing is visible hands is one of the most easy things you can do upon your grand entrance, right? We talk a lot about a grand entrance. This is actually mistakenly not taken advantage of because, for example, doctors will often walk into their waiting room with hands in their lab coat pocket or hands behind their clipboard. Presenters or people will walk into a board meeting with their hands holding a computer or a big file folder and their hands are hidden. People will put one hand in their pocket to look casual. Every time you do that, you're actually activating the fear part of someone's brain, telling them, you can't fully trust me yet. So that's the beginner level, just trying to make sure that they're visible, especially in those first few seconds. The advanced part, and this was what was really exciting, is when I saw this research, I went back to some of the most popular TED Talks, and I wanted to know, were they just doing movement for the sake of movement? Like, was it jazz hands?
Right.
or was there something else going on? And I realized that the most popular TED Talkers were using purposeful hand gestures. In other words, they were actually explaining their concepts with their hands along with their words. So when they talked about a big idea, they would literally hold a big idea like it was a beach ball. When they were talking about 3 different things, they would hold up 3 fingers and then go through each one, 1, 2, 3. They would talk about bringing groups together and they would hold a softball in their left hand and a softball in the right hand and they would mesh them together. That was my brain loved it, right? Our brains love pictures. Just like when you were little, you skimmed through books looking for images or graphics. The same thing happens with really charismatic speakers. And this happens, again, if you're on stage or you're at a coffee shop, either one, where we're trying to see what is someone saying along with their words. It's very, very easy for us to lie verbally or memorize things verbally. So we put 12.5 times more weight on someone's nonverbal gestures. For example, if I were to come on the podcast and say, I'm so excited to be here. You can't even see my hands or my body language, but you can tell from my voice tone that there's something incongruent, right? It doesn't match my words. The same thing happens with hand gestures. We want the words to align with our hands. And that's like a really advanced magic technique that the best, most charismatic speakers use.
Very interesting. What else did y'all discover through the TED Talk study?
So the other thing that we really focused on was vocal power. So, when I talk about, we study a lot of nonverbal behavior in our lab. And when I talk about nonverbal, I mean body language, but also facial expression and voice tone. So voice tone is really important for nonverbal. And I don't know, do you guys ever talk about vocal power at all on the podcast?
No. So we feel free to dive into it because it's definitely something we have not covered yet.
So vocal power is, I think, an underutilized thing just because it's really hard to study. For example, if you ask someone, make someone listen to their voicemail, they often are like, I hate what I sound like. And I'm always like, that's so interesting because your vocal power is everything, right? Like we think about what we want to say, we script out our pitch, we have bullet points, we've rehearsed the perfect elevator pitch for our business. We very rarely think about how we want to say it. like the vocal power behind it. So one of the biggest differences for TED Talkers is they had a lot of vocal charisma. Specifically, all of these TED Talkers, what I think was really fascinating about this experiment is all of the TED Talkers were incredibly talented. It's not like we pulled random speakers off the street. Everyone who gives a TED Talk is very well vetted, right? They are usually experts in their field, celebrities, researchers, academics, authors. Not only are they extremely intelligent, but they're also often trained, right? Like a lot of TED Talks, most of them go through some kind of training before they hit the stage. So the bar is really high. And I think it's the same thing when I work with a lot of very, very highly competent and technically brilliant founders, entrepreneurs. The bar is always really high. The difference between the really good and the really great TED Talks was that the really good ones had memorized their TED Talk, right? They had clearly practiced it thousands of times in front of the mirror. They had a perfect script, but it sounded like a script. Whereas the really great ones, like the Brene Browns and the Simon Sineks and the Ken Robinsons, it was so memorized that it was actually internalized, where it sounded like they were talking to you over coffee. They were explaining their ideas in a way that was so fluid that it felt natural. So I'll give you an example. Most of the only good TED Talkers sounded something like this. And I'm going to say nonsense just so you can hear the vocal power or the lack of vocal power. Today, I want to talk to you about a very important issue. This very important issue has 3 different things you need to focus on. When we focus on these 3 things, we can change the world. Okay, that's like a good one, right? It's sounds
NPR commercial or something, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. It sounds competent, right? I know what I'm talking about. I'm clearly organized. I've come prepared. But your brain is like, ugh. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, your brain is like, oh, this sounds so boring. So the really great ones come out on stage and sound a little bit more like this. Good morning. So today I want to dive into one of my favorite topics. And this topic, if you can do it, really changes the world. There are 3 different parts. So let's start with the first part. The first part, right, like that's a very, very different kind of vocal power or vocal charisma. Basically, it's the difference between knowing your stuff so well that you really believe it and knowing your stuff where you feel like you have to deliver it. And so I think that the biggest thing with entrepreneurs is they get into this trap. Almost all of my entrepreneurial students have this trap where they've answered the same question a million times before, right? You've answered the question, what do you do? A million times. You've answered the question from investors, what's your unique value proposition? A million times. Or your least favorite questions, right? The really hard ones, you've also grudgingly answered a million times. The problem is if you answer it like you've answered it a million times before, there is no way that someone will want to ask you more questions because they feel that you're bored with your answer. You might not be bored with your company, but if you're bored with your answer, they're bored with your answer too.
I've experienced that once or twice here on the podcast, interviewing someone who, has been making the rounds for the last week or 2. Maybe they've got a new product or launch or, something that they're launching. And they've probably done the same interview 10 times before. And you can hear it in their voice,
Yes.
Like, tell me about your story. Okay, well, just the enthusiasm is gone. It's just on repeat mode now. And you can hear it in every word that they say. And I'm just like, well, this is not going to end well. So yeah.
And I think that, and this is really hard. And I always have this discussion with like technical founders or people who are really technically brilliant where they're like, oh, like I have said it a million times before. I'm not going to change the answer every time I say it. And of course that's true. Like you can't change it every time you say it. But I think that it is our job as entrepreneurs, if we really want people to engage with us and our product and our service, to put in the effort to figure out how we can make it engaging every time. So one exercise that I try to do, and by the way, like I've explained this TED Talk study a lot before, but I love it. Like I still love it, even though I've explained it many times before. So the first thing I try to do is tap into the original excitement that I felt when I first saw those numbers, right? Like I can't even explain what it's like as a researcher because we do so many experiments. Some of them fail, right? Some of them we don't find anything. When I opened that spreadsheet and I saw and we calculated that that was the average difference, 272 versus 465. Like I was just like so excited. I mean, I know that sounds really silly, but I was so excited by that stat because it showed me there was something happening there. So when I explain the TED Talk research, I try to remember what it felt like when I opened that original spreadsheet. The second thing is, And this is, if you've ever taken improv or acting classes, and I highly recommend doing that. I'm a recovering awkward person and very, very introverted, even though it doesn't sound like it. So I had to train myself to be okay sharing things, right? If I wanted to do research, I couldn't stay in my research lab all day long. I had to present it or else I would never get funding again. So I tried to practice, and you can do this with your elevator pitch. Try saying your elevator pitch at least 20 different ways. And there's a really, really cool game. It's called Utter Nonsense. I found it on Amazon. I think it's like a box board game. It's kind of like Cards Against Humanity, but what it is every card has a different way of saying something. So like it'll say Southern accent or Irish accent or like you're a toddler or like you're an old woman or like you have marbles in your mouth. And you have to pick up the accent card and read another card in that accent. Now, I discovered this game purely just because I love board games. And I was like, this is it. Like, this is the training that I need to do to be able to wake up my own brain to try to say things differently. So I do that now with my elevator pitch. And I highly recommend write out your elevator pitch. It's like 1 to 3 sentences and try saying it like a toddler. Try saying it in a Southern accent and then get back to like normal world and try saying it with different cadences, different volumes, different pace. So for example, mine is, I run a human behavior research lab in Portland, Oregon. We study the hidden forces that drive your behavior. Okay, if that's my elevator pitch, I could say that a different way by saying, I run a human behavior research lab in Portland, Oregon, and we study all the hidden forces that drive your behavior. Right, that's one way, and still the normal realm or range. If I wanted to say it in a more competent way, a more influential way, I could deliver it very strongly. So I can add a downward emphasis on my words. That's called the authoritative voice tone. I could say something like, my name is Vanessa. I run a human behavior research lab in Portland, Oregon, and we study the hidden forces that drive our behavior. I'm just playing, but like you kind of get the idea of how you can say one thing many different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's pretty unbelievable how the tone of your voice can, really just have a massive difference in how it's perceived and what's being communicated.
And that happens in person on the phone as well. So I'm talking about videos and in person, but phone is actually a really interesting area that I'm trying to study more of. We're doing right now a vocal power study where we had the same people record hello, which is our first impression on the phone, with different body language, different moods, and different facial expressions. And we found that participants rated those people as different in likability, trustworthiness, and charisma simply based on the nonverbal that they were holding on the other end. So the same person smiling and saying hello versus frowning and saying hello comes across differently.
So I'm thinking back to some personal circumstances, and what you mentioned about being an introvert really surprised me a minute ago because I am as well.
Yeah.
And I often find that I can be out in a social situation and that either my mood or tone or whatever is misconstrued or misunderstood by people, or I'll say something that is taken completely the wrong way.
Could you give me an example? Is it usually that you're perceived as warmer or friendlier than you think, or colder and less friendly as you think?
Colder and more serious. But so there's been circumstances where we've been talking, there's a great connection, then I'll say something which is taken the wrong way. And I don't really know that it was happening in the moment, but I'll figure it out like 30 minutes later. And I'll be like, oh no, I think they really took that the wrong way. And maybe there's still an opportunity to go clarify, and maybe there isn't. So what I've been trying to figure out is there a way to essentially go back and from a practical standpoint, I don't know if it's get feedback or like, I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to ask the question, but how I can go back and somehow get some kind of feedback so that I can learn from the circumstance and adjust moving forward. Mm-hmm. Is there a process for that other than just going up and asking the person, hey, can you give me some feedback?
Well, it's funny. It's funny that you mentioned this. So it's incredible, that you recognize this, because actually every single person has this problem, but very few of us realize that we have it. Like, what's incredible is that most of us think we come across a certain way. And sometimes that we are underestimating ourselves, like we have imposter syndrome. So we think that no one likes us, or we think that we're really awkward when actually people don't perceive that at all. And the other way is that we overestimate our abilities, where we think we're coming across as super likable and super competent, but actually people are like, oh, who's this schmo, right? Like, so the first thing is that it's really good that you even recognize that sometimes it's not what you want. For listeners, I would highly recommend, taking a kind of clarifying moment. I call these big truth moments, big T moments. Do you underestimate or overestimate yourself typically? And the second thing is, I love to ask for direct feedback, although it doesn't have to necessarily be super formalized. For example, one of my favorite behavior hacks is the Franklin effect, which was named after Benjamin Franklin, which talks about how when you ask someone for a favor, they actually end up liking you more. Have you guys ever talked about that on the podcast? I don't want to.
No.
Oh, okay. So it's counterintuitive, right? You would think that asking someone for a favor would actually make them be like irritated with you or feel like, oh, why did this person ask me for something? But actually, what Benjamin Franklin found was he accidentally discovered this idea that he asked his enemy to borrow a rare book from his library. And this enemy, I think it was another senator, was like, oh, you have an interest in rare books, and gave Franklin the book. Franklin read the book, returned it with a thanks. And after that experience, his enemy or the senator treated him with all kinds of respect, and it ended up creating a bond between the two of them. And this has now been studied in a lab where a researcher, I find this study just astounding. So a researcher asks someone to take a math quiz and then pays them a certain amount of money after they take the quiz, depending on how many answers they get right or wrong. When the researcher asks them for the money back and says, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm struggling with meeting my budget on this experiment. Would you mind giving me the money back? People actually rate that experimenter as more likable than the person who just lets them keep the money. Which is like, what? That's crazy. And by the way, a lot of people gave the money back after they just spent all this time taking this math quiz, which means they just did it for free because out of the goodness of their heart, which made me feel happy with humanity. So what I would say is there's two aspects to this. One is that you asking for feedback is actually utilizing the Franklin effect. It increases your likability. It's not acceptance of a limitation or taking advantage of people. It's actually a really great way to bond with people. And second, the feedback you'll probably get would be life-changing, or at least social life-changing, because we very rarely get that kind of feedback. So I would say be casual with it. So either you can approach them in person and say, I'm trying to get a bunch of feedback on my first impression or my pitch or XYZ. Was that okay the way I approached you? How did that feel for you? Right? Like very casual. You could also send an email afterwards with like a follow-up, so great speaking on the phone. So great having that meeting with you. We talked about XYZ points. And by the way, I was thinking about this, and maybe I'm overthinking it, but I was hoping it was okay when I said X. Was that okay for you? Any feedback you have from me would be so much appreciated. I'm working on improving my social strengths.
Right.
Like that, it's such a beautiful way to bond because it's very honest, and it's also getting real feedback from people.
Yeah, I mean, the Benjamin Franklin effect, or that, to me, if I had to guess why, I would have said because it's basically putting yourself in a position of vulnerability and also trust, with the other individual, and so I could see that how the outcome could be positive from that.
It's sorry.
No, go ahead.
But what I was going to say is just vulnerability for a second. I used to be very afraid of vulnerability. I think I felt like in order to impress people, I had to be impressive, and therefore I had to have no weaknesses. And, many people are familiar with the work of Brené Brown, that vulnerability actually makes us more human and more relatable. But I will also mention that there is a scientific principle of, I believe it's called the other shoe effect. How when we're interacting interactions, we often are like waiting for the other shoe to drop. Like if you're on a date or if you're on a pitch or if you're an investor, you meet an entrepreneur and they seem fantastic, right? Like they're like super charismatic and they have their pitch deck perfect and their financials look good. People cannot help but wonder, what's the problem with this person? Where's the thing I don't like?
Yeah.
And so what they found is that everyone has a version of the shoe, right? Like whatever it is, maybe it's like not enough customer validation or not enough sales or whatever. it's better off to drop the shoe yourself earlier on in the first half of your interaction than waiting to drop it at the end and or concealing it entirely. So if you have three options going into an interaction with a VIP, one is trying to conceal the vulnerability or something that you don't want them to know. Two, presenting your best foot forward and waiting till the very end to drop it into mention it very briefly and casually and kind of gloss over it. Or two, preparing for it, bringing it up front and then addressing it. Scientifically speaking, you are so much better off with option number three. That research has found that when you admit a vulnerability up front, it actually lets the person concentrate on your argument because they feel like, oh, phew, okay, that was it. Not so bad. I can handle it. And they're really forthright and upfront. And that was like a huge realization to me. It's how I now, I the first line of my book that I mentioned on this interview is I'm a recovering awkward person. That's because for a long time, that's what I was always trying to hide. And then I realized that actually was way better off for me to get it out of the way. And we notice this effect all the time. It happens on dates and social interactions and pitches, and it's very, very liberating.
Yeah, no, absolutely agreed. I think if you have a 10 out of 10, let's say interaction, a date would probably be the best example that I can think of. At least when I've had that kind of connection with a gal, it's like, well, crap, there's only downhill from here. Right. If it's just like, that was,
yes.
fantastic, everything. Well, it's like, well, that's not going to continue. It's not going to stay at that level, so I've tried to just kind of keep that in mind and be yourself and comfortable and admit faults, especially if the other person has you on a pedestal, let's just say from a business context, right? If it's maybe a new entrepreneur who has read all of your work and just thinks the world of you and they get a chance to meet you. Just being vulnerable to that individual and helping take yourself off the pedestal, I think, really creates an opportunity for a super authentic connection at that point, rather than just a surface level, like, yep, I'm going to play my role as the guru, you're going to play your role as the student, and we'll take our picture and be done.
It's the perfect example I can think of for this, and it's also in sales. Where the other day I was at a restaurant and the waiter was like giving the specials, and I asked like, what was the daily soup? And he said, oh, it's like a barley pumpkin. And I was like, is it good? And he like looked at me and he was like, it's not very good. And I'm telling you, from that moment on, I was like, whatever this waiter recommends, I will eat it. Like I will order it, because he admitted a weakness, right? And so I didn't get the cup of soup, which how rare is it? And the waiter says, actually, that's not very good. And so my very next question, instead of looking at the menu, was, what would you recommend? And I ordered exactly what he recommended: appetizer, main, and dessert. Whereas before I would have never ordered 3 courses, but because I trusted him, because he dropped that truth, that vulnerability, I immediately ordered more. So it's also a really important sales technique because it helps people build trust in you.
Now, to change gears just a little bit here, all of us have an opportunity to meet individuals that can have a drastic impact on our lives. One of those opportunities for me was meeting Peter Diamandis for the first time, who ended up joining essentially the board of advisors and taking a piece of equity in my hydroponics company, right? So I've got really one chance to meet Peter and make a good impression and to create a connection that leads to a second conversation. And that happens quite often on the podcast all the time, where I have opportunities to meet amazing individuals. Another one I just met earlier today was Jeff Hoffman, who, is the billionaire founder of Priceline. Mm-hmm. And if I pursue a relationship, correctly with him, I have an opportunity to maybe at some point have him as a mentor or once again on my board. So what advice can you give for everyone listening when it comes to succeeding at those kinds of connections, right? I've got one chance to meet Peter. It's at an event. What can I do to pull that off successfully?
Yeah. So there's a lot of juicy tips, but I think that the basic, most important one is also not often thought about, which is make it really easy for them to help you. So the biggest mistake that people make when talking to VIPs is that they leave it up to the VIP to tell them how they can help. So for example, they say things like, hey, I'd love to grab coffee and pick your brain. pick your brain is the worst phrase in the English language, in my opinion. I get pick your brain request emails, I mean, at least 3 or 4 times a week.
Yeah, same. Coffee and stuff. Yeah.
Yes, they drive me crazy. Or I love your work. I love what you do. I would love to partner with you in some way. Let me know.
Right.
Or I read your book. It changed my life. Oh my God, I love it so much. I just wanted to email you and tell you that and see if there was ways that we could work together. Here's my company. It does all these things. I can't wait to work together. Now, with all of those, they're very kind. They're very genuine. They're flattering, kind of, but that creates work for the VIP. It makes them have to think about what how they can help you or how you can help them. It's also really hard to, like, it almost invites someone to ask for a favor. Like, for example, let's say that I'm pitching a new course or I'm promoting a new course and someone just emailed me that they love my book, they're happy to help. It's still hard for me to write back and say, oh, really? That's so great. You'd like to help. Would you mind buying and promoting my course for me? No, like I'm not going to ask that even though they just offered help. So I would say it's really important to be very, very specific in that first moment. So you mentioned, on your board of directors, that's a really specific request and you can even make it more specific, right? So like, I'm honored by your work. I love your leadership style. I have an opening on my board of directors. You're the perfect kind of person I would love to have in that position. Let me explain what it's about, how I think it can help you too, how many hours it is. Would you be open to considering it? That kind of ask, you're either going to get a no, but, so no, but I could do XYZ, which is great, or yes, and I'm happy to start as soon as possible or, after the busy season or whatever it is. So being really, really specific in your emails and calls, I think is incredibly important. Never ask someone to pick their brain. Never ask someone for an informational interview. It's just the worst. I think that's like the worst thing. I avoid those emails like the plague.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's just too general. So with successful people, their single most valuable asset is their time, right? Mm-hmm. And an email or a request like that filled with generalities of like, hey, I'd love to go grab coffee. I'm in town, and I don't know who you are. I've got to take time away from whatever's a priority in my world to go show up and keep my fingers crossed that it's going to be a beneficial conversation for both of us. So,
right.
And without any further details, it makes it impossible for me to gauge that. So the answer is an automatic no.
Right. And I also think, with the same thing that we were talking about is, okay, like, let's say, your mentor is coming to town and you really want to take them out for coffee. What do you do? Right? Like, what do you do? I think there's a formula, and I've used this formula with many, many people to meet almost all of my mentors at this point. I have 2 left on the list, working on them, which is first, give them a very, very specific compliment. So not just, I love your work or your book changed my life, but this specific chapter and this specific skill I use in this specific way. As a writer, I will tell you when I get those emails, like they make me tear up, like I save them, I forward them to my team, I forward them to my mom. Like those are the ones that like make my day because I really, really believe them. And also I worked really hard on that specific thing. So first start with a very specific compliment or way that you used their existing advice. Second, a very, very specific offer. So for example, I have one of my academic crushes. All of my VIPs, by the way, are academics. Like I love academics so much. One of them is Paul Zak. He's Dr. Paul Zak. He's a researcher for oxytocin, the molecule. And so I love him. I've been like watching his career. So he's coming to Portland for a speaking event. So I reached out, told him exactly why I like his work. I even have a necklace of oxytocin, like the chemical structure. I'm really cool like that. And so I sent him a picture of the necklace, said your work really inspired me in these ways. The second thing you want to ask is that specific request. So I said, I know you're only in Portland for a few days. There are 2 things that every tourist to Portland has to get. One is a voodoo donut. We have amazing donuts in this town. 2 is to see our temperate rainforest right in Portland. I would be happy to order you a special case of voodoo donuts so you don't have to wait in line and or give you a secret trail hike in Forest Park if you are interested in either of those things. He was interested in both, which was great. And then I specifically said at the end what I was looking for as well. Because the other thing that VIPs are always worried about is, oh man, what's the other shoe, right? What is the ask here? And so I said at the very end of the email, I was like, and I have a new book coming out. You were actually in chapter 8. I'd be honored to give you a copy when I see you. and see if you like your chapter, if you'd be open to endorsing the book. No pressure. If not, I can also leave the book at home. So he immediately wrote back and said, yes, no problem. Let's go get a voodoo donut and then let's hike it off. I was like, great. Sounds like a perfect thing. And he's like, send me an early galley of your book so I can look at it before I get there so we can talk about it. So I think that formula works really well and it's served me very well. Even if I didn't get a yes right away, like if someone was too busy for the specific request, I almost always got a no, but. So no, I can't do that, but why don't you join me at my event that night? Or no, but let's hop on the phone later today. I'm heading to the airport. We can chat it through. So I think that's a really specific way that you can reach out to VIPs.
From a body language standpoint, I'm of the opinion, just personally, that if I'm meeting someone new, especially if it's someone that I look up to or whatever it may be, I want to have my first interaction with them as close to a peer type of relationship as possible, not from a starstruck, sign my book kind of deal, but like, hey, Peter, great. How's life? How are the kids? How are the family? That kind of a deal. From a body language standpoint, what tips or advice can you give to folks so that they come off more relaxed and more confident and not the shy stalker, like waiting on the sidelines to get an edge in or word, if that makes sense? Mm-hmm. But just so that the other person is put at ease and it's not like this body language implied, like, okay, that person's waiting to get something from me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I'm so impressed that you can do that. I don't know if I'm quite cool enough to have the friend.
I'm sure I'm not successful very often, but it's what I attempt to do. So, yeah.
Okay, so the way that I do this, and I've not been able to do this successfully every time, but I've been able to, when I've done this, it's worked really well. And the friendship approach is basically trying to assess a very small need. So, for example, when I heard someone that I admired them a lot. I knew they were coming to speak. I was like, okay, what would their need be right here? And so I offered to, when I met them, it was before the event. I was like, I know they're probably gonna be milling around before the event. I was like, you know what? I bet he would love a cup of tea or a cup of coffee as I do before I speak. And so instead of like having all these people who are like, oh my God, your book, amazing, amazing. I walked up and I said, hey, I'm going to get myself tea. I always love tea before I speak. Can I grab you a chamomile tea or can I grab you a protein bar? And he actually said yes. I've done that also at networking events where I said, can I grab you a glass of wine? Can I grab you a drink? Hey, do you want to break from all the chatting? Do you want me to, pull you aside and give you a couple of minutes? Like I try to think about what that need is. And every single time, whether that they take me up on the offer of the drink or the break or the whatever, they are so grateful typically because it's truly what I wish someone would do for me in those moments. And almost always it's met with like that kind of kinship approach.
No, it's brilliant. That's brilliant. It changes the whole dynamic and it instantly sets you apart from every other single person who's trying to get a moment of that individual's time, which is awesome. And
almost always they ask, I was going to say almost always then they ask like, oh, no, I'm good for tea, but do you do a lot of public speaking? That is way better than, so what do you do? Right. And then I can say, yeah, I do public speaking on human behavior and the quirks of human behavior, similar to what you do in XYZ. Like, and then I can like loop it back into what they're doing. So it's a very easy way to make it easy on them to ask me something. Remember that like VIPs also are talking all day long usually. And so they're meeting all these people and it's hard to make conversation with a stranger. So if you give them a really easy thing to ask about, or you ask them a question, not necessarily about them. Like I always hate it when people ask me questions like, so how'd you get started in what you do? Or I'm like, really? Like that's what you want to ask me now? Like you could look that up on the website. So I like it way better when they're like, oh, I was working on this thing and I saw you were too. Are you still working on that? Now that's something interesting to talk about. So making it easy in terms of conversation is another aspect that you can gift to a VIP.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, our time together has gone by super, super fast, and I know you've got a hard cutoff in 3 minutes. So, but this was a super fun conversation, and a lot of these podcasts, 20 minutes in, I'm like, okay, great. What are we going to talk about next? And this one, it just flew by, and I've still got a bunch of questions, but. In the meantime, where can people go connect with you, follow you, and pick up a copy of Captivate?
Yeah. So everything is on my website. My lab is scienceofpeople.com. You can play in our lab. You can do our vocal power quiz and hear all those hellos. We have all of our 30 articles that change your life. And then Captivate, just out. It's wherever books are sold.
Awesome. Well, Vanessa Van Edwards, it was an absolute pleasure to finally get to connect and to meet you. This is an unbelievably important topic again, where that one meeting or phone call really has the potential to change your life, because there's only two things that have that kind of impact, which is new information and new relationships. So I would encourage everyone to dive into this topic, especially if you're a recovering socially awkward individual such as Vanessa and I. Welcome to the club. And
welcome.
Absolutely. So thank you for the time, Vanessa. This was fantastic. I'm sure the book's going to do incredibly well. And this was a real pleasure. So thank you so much.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. And guys, gals, thank you for listening as always. And we will see you next week. Take care.